Hello dear, today we will try to understand about stress exposure risk vulnerability related to climate hazard and disaster. In earlier classes we have discussed about different aspects of climate changes, meaning concept and approaches, and the evidences of climate change. So today we will try to understand about this related aspect of climate changes, how it affects the society, how a society is vulnerable towards climate change, and different what you call disaster risk factor, exposure of a society, etc. So climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings, as we have discussed earlier, and maybe persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of atmosphere or inland use. Anthropogenic climate changes is projected to continue during this century and beyond. This conclusion is robust under a wide range of scenarios for future greenhouse gas emissions, including some that anticipate a reduction in emission. Indeed, the local outcomes of climate change are uncertain as far as considering different variables to understand this change. Studies have projected the alteration in the frequency, intensity, spatial extent, or duration of weather and climate extremes, including climate and hydrometeorological events such as heat waves, as we have discussed earlier, heavy precipitational events, drought, and tropical cyclones. So we are quite aware of these measures, and there is quite advance in technology to understand all these change in events due to climate change. Such change is in a context of increasing vulnerability will lead to increased stress on human and natural systems and a propensity of serious adverse effect in many places around the world. At the same time, climate change is also expected to bring benefits to certain places and communities at particular times. So, there is increasing knowledge and understanding of the factors that lead to adverse effects of climate change, impact on loss of life, with the occurrence of hydrometeorological events, economic and social impacts in recent time. We have discussed these aspects in earlier classes, and we have also understood that there is advancement in understanding climate change and in its impact in overall global climate system and the meteorological system. So, regard to losses associated with tropical cyclones, recent analysis has shown that with the exception of the East Asian and Pacific and South Asian regions, both exposure and the estimated risk of economic losses are growing faster than GDP per capita. So, this type of research are there already around the world, and it is quite now easy to understand this what you call losses associated with climate change and disaster. However, understanding the social aspect to climate variability is not in pace with the rapid understanding of impacts and causes. It means we are less aware about how society responds to such climate change variability or disaster. So these social aspects what you call include social response, exposure of a society towards climate change, how they adapt over time, and management of risk of what they call disaster risk. All these aspects we are going to discuss in this lesson. But the HIGO framework of action adopted by 168 government provides a point of reference for disaster risk management and its practical implementation. Even United Nations statement suggests the need for closer integration of disaster risk management and adaptation with climate change concerns and goals, all in the context of development and development planning. So these are the important things regarding why we are giving more emphasis on social aspects of climate change. So such a concern led to the agreement between the what you call IPCC and the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction with the support of the Norwegian government to undertake managing the risk of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. It includes climate change and its effect on extreme events, disaster, then disaster risk management, human response to extreme event and disaster, based on historical experience and evolution in practice could contribute to adaptation objectives and processes, and how adaptation to climate change could be more closely integrated with disaster risk management practice. So these are the aspect or social aspect of the climate change. Okay, how it impacts a society, what are the risk management system that has been developed in our society or in different countries, etc., etc. So before going to discuss about all the processes and techniques to understand these things, we need to clarify certain concepts that are often used in what you call understanding the social aspect of climate change. So we'll go one by one first. First one is extreme events, as we have discussed in earlier classes regarding there is changing pattern of rainfall or what you call increase in temperature. So it comprises a facet of climate variability under stable or changing climatic conditions. They are defined as the occurrence of a value of weather or climate variable, and that may be rainfall, temperature, pressure, wind speed. So is defined as the occurrence of a value of a weather variables, a threshold value near the upper or lower end of the range of observed values of the variable. So this is the extreme, means generally what occurs, and these extreme events means this value, the weather value crosses the threshold limit of the average value. Then that event, it may be rainfall, it may be temperature, then we call it extreme event. Like we have discussed about what you call increase in rainfall pattern, or maybe different weather like recently the cyclonic activities. All these are now extreme now because they are crossing certain threshold limit. Earlier it may be 2 cyclones per year, now it is 10 cyclones per year. Next one is hazardous physical event. So the hazardous physical events refer to the definition of disaster may be of natural or socio-natural or purely anthropogenic origin. It is also sometimes called hazard. This is very important. Hazard can be defined as the potential occurrence of a natural or human induced physical event that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impact, as well as damage and loss to property, infrastructure, livelihood, service provisions, and environmental resources. So here when we talk about hazards, we are talking about the potential occurrence of natural or human-made what you call these extreme events. Even it is not extreme events, that may also have the potentiality to cause this type of impact in the society. So when there is potentiality of causing damage to the society, then we call it hazard. It may be extreme event or it may be general event, but if it has the potentiality, we are not talking about the occurrence. if it has potential to impact the damage in the society and property, then we call it hazard. So physical events become hazards where social elements like environmental resources that support human welfare and security and exposed to their potentially adverse impact and exist under conditions that could predispose them to such effect. Thus, hazard is used in this study to denote a threat or potential for adverse effects, not the physical events. So here we don't call it as hazard if there is flood until and unless it has the potentiality to damage the society. Okay. So physical events that may acquire the characteristics of a hazard if conditions of exposure, these are very important, we will be again discussing this concept, conditions of exposure and vulnerability convert them into a threat. This includes earthquakes, volcanoes and tsunamis among others. Any other geographic area may be affected by one or a combination of such events at the same or different time. So just for general example to understand, if there is an earthquake, so it may be a hazard because there is potentiality of having damage due to what we call earthquake. So if there is earthquake in desert, there is no population, so it may not, you may not call it as hazard because there is no any damage to the society or to the people itself. But if that earthquake happen to occur in populated area, so that earthquake may be called as hazard here. So when extreme and non-extreme physical events such as tropical cyclones, floods and droughts can affect elements of human systems in an adverse manner, they assume the characteristics of a hazard. So this is very important to remind. Now let us also discuss about disaster. Now you may get confused with what is hazard and disaster because many people or laymen use these two terms synonymously, but there are little differences between hazard and disaster. So severe alterations in the normal functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous physical events interacting with the vulnerable social conditions leading to widespread adverse human, material, economic or environmental effects that require immediate emergency response to satisfy critical human needs and that may require external support for recovery, then we call it disaster. So in case of hazard, it may be extreme event or non-extreme event, but if it has potentiality to damage a society, then we call it hazard. But in case of disaster, here we are talking about the physicality of that hazard. It has already had widespread adverse effect on human material conditions, then we call it disaster. Okay. Here we are not talking about potentiality, but it has already affected. If it is already affected, then it is called a disaster. So extreme events are often but not always associated with disaster. Non-extreme physical events also can and do lead to disasters where physical or social conditions foster such a result. So natural hazards are geographical events which occur naturally on, above and under the surface of the earth. On like flood, above like drought and cyclone, and under like earthquake. These are called all hazards. However, if one of these natural hazards leads to significant loss of human life, demand to property, environmental damage, it is called natural disaster or disaster. Got it? So this is the difference between hazard and what you call disaster. So social disaster where extreme impacts on the physical and ecological system may or may not play a part, and so-called environmental disasters, where direct physical impacts of human activities and natural physical processes on the environment are fundamental causes. Okay. So social and natural, these are quite easy to differentiate between these two terms. Now the another concept is called disaster risk, which is very important for this what you call unit to understand. So the occurrence of disaster is always preceded by the existence of specific physical and social conditions that are generally referred to as disaster risk. So before any disaster occurred, the conditions available within that settlement, within that place, that conditions is actually called the disaster risk. That is referred to disaster risk. But this is not a so straightforward term. Okay. So it is defined for the purpose of this study as the likelihood over a specific time period of severe alterations in the normal functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous physical events interacting with vulnerable social conditions leading to widespread adverse human, material, economic or environmental effects that require immediate emergency response to satisfy critical human needs and that may require external support for recovery. It is widely recognized as the consequences of the interaction between a hazard and the characteristics that make people and place vulnerable and exposed. So even vulnerable and exposure, these are also different terms we need to understand, and we will be going to discuss this aspect later on. So you may have a little idea about disaster risk. So a settlement, a place, a community may have disaster risk if they have such type of preconditions that may affect the hazard, or hazard may affect that society, then those conditions will actually what you call define what type of damage it will have. So disaster are something considered external shocks, but disaster risk result from the complex interactions between development processes that generate conditions of exposure, vulnerability and hazard. See, so disaster risk equal to hazard into exposure into vulnerability. So hazard, it's the severity and frequency of hazard which affect which ultimately what you call define the risk of that area. Exposure means the number of people and assets that is exposed to that certain hazard, also define the what you call disaster risk of that area, and their vulnerability to damage. We are going to discuss about this concept vulnerability in later slides. Okay. So all these the hazards, the exposure, how much people are exposed to these hazards and how much they are vulnerable, all actually define the disaster risk of that area, disaster risk of that community or people, etc. Okay. So these are the preconditions which are actually defined by the severity of hazards, exposure and vulnerability. If there are such conditions exist, even there is more hazards, even they are not what you call uh, affected by the hazard, then their risk factor is less. Suppose there is less exposure, so even there is high severity of hazards, then also that society has less risk. So all these three factors or variables actually define how much a community or a place is what you call a community has the risk or disaster risk, how much risk they have. Okay. So in order to understand disaster risk, it is essential to understand that it is forward looking, like the likelihood of losses of life, destruction and damage in a given period of time. It is quite dynamic in nature. It can increase or decrease. It is indivisible to a certain extent because it comprises of not only the threats of high impact events but also frequency, low impact events that are often hidden, and it is also unevenly distributed around the earth, and we also need to understand the emergent and complex situations, like many processes including climate change and globalized economic development are creating new interconnected risk of that area. So as we have discussed earlier, the risk is the what you call risk is equal to what the hazards, exposure and vulnerability. So we know what is hazards. Now what is exposure? So exposure is employed to refer the presence of people, livelihoods, environmental services and resources, infrastructure or economic, social or cultural assets in places that could be adversely affected by physical events and which thereby are subject to potential future harm, loss or damage. Means how many things are actually exposed to the what you call the hazard. So this definition subsumes physical and biological system under the concept of environmental service and resources, accepting that these are fundamental for human welfare and security. And this exposure refers to the people, property, systems or other elements present in hazard zone that are thereby subject to potential loss. So which are the people which people are exposed to certain hazard? Suppose if there is cyclone, who are exposed? The people settled near coastal areas are exposed. Which properties are exposed? So exposure means we are assessing those people, property or system who are present in that hazard zone, and if something happen, these people are will get affected by the hazard. Then this is what we call estimation of the exposure of the hazard or exposure of the disaster risk. If hazard occurs in an area of no exposure, then there is no risk. Remember the formula of disaster risk equal to what? Hazard into exposure into vulnerability. Now, if exposure is 0, then 0 into damage, how much damage it may be, or what is the extremity of the hazard it may be, what may be the what you call extremity of vulnerability may be. If exposure is 0, then disaster risk is also 0. You may recall the formula of disaster risk equal to hazards into exposure into vulnerability. So when exposure is 0, there is no risk or there is no disaster risk of that community or of that place at all. Now the last one, as the last aspect of the formula of disaster risk is vulnerability. So under exposed conditions, the levels and types of adverse impact will be the result of a physical events. Interacting with socially constructed conditions denotes a vulnerability. So in case of vulnerability, we are talking about the socially constructed conditions which make an area, a group of people more prone to what we call hazards. Okay, that is called vulnerability. So it is defined as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. Such predispositions constitutes an internal characteristics of the affected elements. In the field of disaster risk, this includes the characteristics of a person's, their situations which influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist and recover from the adverse effect of physical events. So here we are talking about actually the socially constructed conditions. It may be the character of a people, actually the character of a group. What are the different socio-economic conditions? What are the political conditions? And what are their organizational resources which led them resist the and recover from the adverse effect of physical events. Got it? So how their society or the structure of the society is made up of, so that they can uh, anticipate with the effect of physical events, then we call this aspect as vulnerability. So vulnerability is a result of diverse historical, social, economic, political, cultural and institutional, natural resource and environmental conditions and processes. Okay, so this is not a very small term. If a society's structure and organization capacity is such that they can easily cope up with certain extreme event, then they are less vulnerable. Often developed societies have such kind of institutions in their society that they can easily overcome certain extreme events, so they are less vulnerable. And mostly the poor people who don't have like any that kind of socially constructed systems to cope up with such events, then they are more vulnerable. So vulnerability is not a one way aspect. It comes from economic, political, social, cultural background, even historical background. Okay, so all these aspects make a group vulnerable or not. So the earlier IPCC definitions of vulnerability refers, however, to the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So vulnerability is a function of the character, magnitude and rate of climate change and variations to which a system is exposed, its sensitivity and its adaptive capacity. Okay. So vulnerability is the human dimension of disaster risk. Okay. Hazards, the external thing; exposure, the physical entity which may be exposed or not exposed due to its location; and vulnerability is the human dimension. It comes from economy, social structure or cultural background of the society, how they are capable of overcome that extreme event. It is the result of the range of economic, social and cultural institutions, as we have earlier discussed, political and psychological factors that shape people's lives and the environment that they live in. It tends to mean different things to different people, like fragility, weakness, deficiency, lack of capacity. So if a society is more fragile, they are more vulnerable. If they are weak, they are vulnerable. If they are strong, they are less vulnerable. If they have deficiency in their system itself, they are more vulnerable. If they have lack of capacity, they are more vulnerable. If they have capacity, they are not vulnerable at all. There are multiple dimensional factors and drivers that create vulnerability. Means that susceptibility to the impact of hazards is often but not always associated with certain groups. Okay. So these multi-dimensional factors includes the physical factors like the poor design and construction of buildings, unregulated land use planning. These are the physical factors which define vulnerability. Then uninsured informal sectors, vulnerable rural livelihood. These are the economic factors. Dependence on single industries, globalization of business, etc. These are what you call economic factors which define vulnerability. If it is insured informal sector, then vulnerability is less. If there is loss, they can make up. But if it is uninsured, then their vulnerability is high. Even what you call dependence on single industries, if there are lots of industries, if there is what you call uh, economic recession, then they can easily cope up with, they are less vulnerable. But if there is only one industry over which all this area is dependent on, and if there is recession, and then obviously it will impact, they are less vulnerable, or they are more vulnerable. The social factors like inequality, marginalization, social exclusion, and discrimination by gender, social status, disability, and age, all these are social aspect of vulnerability. Suppose in case of gender, women are more prone to what you call impact, or more prone to be affected by the disaster or hazard than the male counterparts. Or all these aspects actually define how a society is vulnerable. In certain societies, women cannot cope up with certain what you call hazardous situations, but men can easily cope up with. Those are the aspects of what you call, or social aspects of vulnerability. Inequality, if there is inequality in case of what you call distribution of resources, the poor people cannot cope up. So there are different aspects of vulnerabilities, like all this what you call physical, economic, and social aspects. Even there are another angle of this vulnerability called environmental aspects. Environmental management, overconsumption of natural resources, decline of risk regulating ecosystem services. If these things are available, then that society is less vulnerable. If these facilities are not available, then they will be obviously vulnerable to these external shocks. So continue with the concept of vulnerability. We have discussed about the concept of capacity there. So how we will define capacity? Capacity refers to the combinations of all the strengths, attributes, and resources available to an individual. So capacity refers to the combinations of all the strengths, attributes, and resources available to an individual, community, society, or organizations that can be used to achieve established goals. This include the conditions and characteristics that permit society at large to access to land, social, economic, psychological, cultural, livelihood related natural resources, as well as access to information and the institutions of governance necessary to reduce vulnerability and deal with the consequences of disaster. Okay. The lack of capacity may be seen as being one dimension of overall vulnerability. So you may be confused with what is capacity and vulnerability again here. Uh, So while it is also seen as a separate notion, that although contributing to an increase in vulnerability is not part of vulnerability per se, the existence of vulnerability does not mean an absolute, but rather a relative lack of capacity. They are completely opposite term. Therefore, it can be said that even poor and vulnerable people may have capacity. So capacity, we are talking about the what you call the strength that a society has to achieve their goals. But in case of vulnerability, the conditions which let them affect or not affect. Okay, that is the difference between capacity and vulnerability. But there are another term called coping capacity. So it can be defined as the ability to use of available skills, resources, and opportunities to address, manage, and overcome adverse conditions with the aim of achieving basic functioning in the short to medium term. Here we are talking about ability to use of available skills, but capacity means if they have the resources and strength, then they have the capacity. But in case of coping capacity, if they are able to use all these resources, then it is called coping capacity. The capacity to cope requires continued awareness, resources, and good management both in normal times as well as during crisis. Okay. And this coping capacity depends on adequate household assets and supportive social and governance relations, and can be thought of as component of wider capacity development for disaster risk reduction. Now, another term we often use is resilience. This is defined as the ability of a system and its component part to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effect of potentially hazardous events in a timely and efficient manner, including through ensuring the preservations, restorations, or improvement of its essential basic structures and functions. So, resilience is a wider term. It's the ability to flourish in the face of disaster risk. It never allows to lose its resources. It ensures the preservation, restoration, and improvement of its essential basic structure and function. Okay. So it is about anticipating, planning, and reducing risk to effectively protect persons, communities, and countries, their livelihoods, health, cultural heritage, socio-economic assets, and economic system. So vulnerability, it refers to the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or assets that make it susceptible to the damaging effect of hazards. So, if a community is vulnerable or not depends on what are the qualities they have, which factors is affecting, which make them more vulnerable. But in case of resilience, it's the ability to flourish. It is not just about ability to face and manage disaster at that moment. But when we call ability to face and manage disaster at that moment, we call it coping capacity. But if yes, we have the ability to face and manage disaster, but more than that, we have the ability to flourish in the face of disaster risk, not just disaster, but disaster risk, and ensure the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structure. Then we call it what they call resilience. Our society is resilient to disaster risk. And the capacity is just capacity. It means strength and resources available to the available to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the disaster. So if you have capacity like the physical strength, and like you have resources, different resources, your government has lots of money, then you have capacity to overcome. And if your society is able to use these resources to overcome, that is called coping capacity. Okay. So this is for today. We'll be going to discuss more about how to use this what you call concept to understand disaster risk in later classes. Thank you very much.